All right, I have it on my clock that it is 2:20 Eastern, and we are going to get started promptly because I have a lot of material to get through. Hey, Michael. So, hello, DrupalCon. Welcome to my session. I'm excited to talk to you today about multi-sites. So my name is Jay Callicott, and I've been working with Drupal for about 15 years now, 12 of those with Media Current. Currently, my title is VP of Technical Operations, and I'm also the product owner of our Rain distribution for Drupal. And so during that time, I've worked on a lot of multi-sites and learned some lessons along the way, so that I'll be sharing with you today. So I am here on behalf of Media Current. At Media Current, we help organizations elevate and advance their open source digital experience. Now, we've got a lot of items to cover today, so we're going to dive right in. I'm going to do my best to leave some time for Q&A at the end, but don't worry, they don't like kick us out, and we'll also have like a bonus Q&A over at the Media Current booth as well. So we definitely want to get to any questions you have. All right, first of all, what is a multi-site? I'm assuming that most of you know what a multi-site is, but I'm going to summarize it. A multi-site essentially lets you run multiple Drupal instances off of the same code base. And so that means the same code, but multiple databases. Now, why would you want to run a multi-site? Well, some common use cases I've seen are university departments, government agencies, different business units within the same organization, and microsites. Now, the last one is interesting and important because microsites operate in this kind of gray area where you might not actually need a true multi-site. And so we'll get into something I call fake multi-sites, which gives you some of the same benefits of a Drupal multi-site without running an actual multi-site implementation. We'll do that in a minute, but let's talk benefits. Why would you even want to do this? Why not just create, multiple distinct websites? Well, the main benefit, of course, is that you're able to more easily share functionality, features, and configuration while allowing separate databases for content and users. And so this makes sites much more maintainable over the course of time than if you manage each of these separately. Now, there are gotchas along the way. So I want to give you some good direction on the best way to set up and manage your organization's multi-site. But before we get into that, I want to first cover this idea of fake multi-sites, right? So I call a fake multi-site, it looks like a distinct site. Maybe the theme is different or the navigation is different. Maybe you have a different entry page. The difference, of course, is that in that instance, you're just running off a single Drupal database, a single Drupal instance. And so the benefits are one login, one database of user accounts, content sharing is really easy, and then maintenance is easier. And setup is simpler too. So let's say you've got like a 3-page microsite. Do you really need a multi-site for that? Or could you just add some application logic that gives you an alternate navigation, maybe based on the subdomain that you're hitting? So for this sort of thing, domain access is probably your best bet. They've got a lot of different submodules and functionality. I've also done this with just some settings.php trickery. When you need something really simple, you can do some different overrides just within your site's configuration folder. And so that's an approach I've taken. Definitely should be a consideration. So speaking of considerations, you're going to need to walk through a decision tree if you're planning a project like this. So there's several questions you need to ask yourself when you're deciding whether to do a multi-site or, like I mentioned, this kind of fake multi-site approach. So the first question is, are you going to have the same group of authors or are you going to have different authors? If you have different, then multi-site's good for that. If you have the same authors, then you have to come up with a solution for them to easily log in to the different sites. And so that means you might need like a single sign-on implementation. Do you need to share a lot of content across the site? This comes up a lot. If the content's completely different, that's good. It's in different databases. That's great. If you need to do a lot of content sharing, well, then you need a solution for that because that's not super easy, like out of the box. And then another question is how uniform or different looking are the various sites? If they're very different, then again, multi-site's good. If we're just talking about the navigation's a little bit different or the front page is different, so the microsite thing, well, then maybe we don't need a multi-site. And then you need to decide, okay, well, should I mess with multi-sites at all? Should I just create separate projects for, each new site that I'm building in my organization? So for me, even if the sites are pretty different, I still lean towards trying to have a unified platform for an organization because you can still have a pretty high degree of variance across the sites, but have the advantages of that unified code base. And so the approach I've taken before is if having different custom install profiles, that can allow you to have a lot of variance within the platform, but still have the advantages of everything being under the same umbrella. So something to think about there. Okay, now let's talk about setup and configuration. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that your host supports multi-site. So like Pantheon as an example, they don't actually support Drupal multi-site config in kind of the classical sense. And so you don't want to, if the host doesn't support multi-site, you don't want to spend time configuring it a certain way and then it's like incompatible. So do your due diligence up front there. And we'll get into how Pantheon approaches it later on. Most hosts are going to let you park multiple domains, let you create separate databases. You just need to make sure that it's compatible. And so we're not going to get into the weeds of like how you set things up. There's lots of documentation and tutorials out there for how to set up site configuration and all that. And that's not going to be where you're going to get tripped up in this sort of thing. Where we need to spend our time doing the thinking and planning is in our approach to governance and Drupal configuration management, because that's where you're going to run into trouble if you're going to run into trouble anywhere. So good governance, good configuration management is absolutely critical. If you don't do this right, you're going to have problems. Okay, so what do I mean by governance? Governance involves how the sites are managed and how much control you're going to allow each site to have. And so a big question relates to the size and the scale of the project. If you've only got a few sites, well, then you're probably not going to run into problems because there's only so many ways you can screw that up, right? I mean, it's just a handful of sites. Where you're going to run into problems is when you've got dozens of sites or hundreds of sites. If you don't set things up right, then you're going to find that it's harder to maintain those sites. It's harder to push out routine updates and feature updates if it isn't configured well. And so let's talk about configuration approaches. The option one is no configuration sharing at all. So in that scenario, every site has their own configuration. Maybe it's in version control, maybe it's not, but it's like Wild West. Every site has its own configuration. And again, if you've only got a few sites, okay, that could work just fine. But then that's going to be really hard to maintain if you have dozens or more sites, because it's going to be a challenge to deploy new configuration, things like that. But that's one approach. The second approach is kind of the flip side of that, which is only allowing very simple settings.php overrides. And so that's going to keep things pretty uniform, but maybe just like the site name is different in terms of like configuration. Of course, each site will have a lot of variance in content and users, but configuration, you would keep things very uniform. So the upside here is that setup's going to be, pretty maintainable. And then there's ways of kind of splitting the difference. So config split is good when you want to break off just some configuration. A good example that I've run into are web forms, which are kind of like half content, half configuration. You may want to allow sites to be able to create web forms. And so you can use the config split module to break that off. And then like config actions features, there's other modules, but these are the ones that I'm like more familiar with. So this would take the approach where at a platform level, you're controlling some configuration, maybe some views and content types and blocks, but then you're allowing a lot of custom configuration outside of the individual features that you are like controlling at a platform level. And so that, of course, allows for more flexibility. The sites can do different things. This might make sense if you want to allow sites to install their own modules. And so you'll manage a certain subset of configuration, but then you're going to allow a lot of customization. And so that kind of brings me to the next point, which is, how much control should we allow? How much flexibility are we going to allow? So for me, I lean towards uniformity unless there is a strong case for that flexibility. I really like the unified platform idea. I like it for brand consistency, easier maintenance, upkeep, and it's going to scale better. Again, this isn't a problem if you've only got a few sites. Where you're going to run into issues, it's going to be 20 sites, 50 sites, 100 sites is where you're going to run into problems. So again, features and config actions, taking that type of approach does give you more flexibility, but it's at a cost because you've added some risk of instability because there's more variance across the platform. All right, now let's talk deployment. So deploying code is pretty simple. The whole point of this, right, is that we've got just one code base. So deploying code is going to be the same kind of process as deploying a single site. You've got that unified code base. Two things to think about. You are going to need to deploy database updates for each site instance and as well as those configuration updates. And so you're going to want some sort of mechanism to deploy those like efficiently. So that could be if you're running your own stack, then doing some kind of scripting. And then if you are using a third-party host, you can take advantage of their different toolings. Like Pantheon has a CLI, Acquia has hooks, and so you'll have some options there. Okay, and so next, that kind of leads me into just talking about general management and update recommendations for multi-site. So again, if you take the approach of this unified platform, you're going to want to prevent configuration from being changed on the sites because it could lead to some problems. Like Drupal has a lot of UI modules. A lot of them are kind of turned on by default, and you're going to want to turn those off if you're not actually allowing those sites to change configuration. So for example, if you're not going to allow views to be created on the site, and then you'll want to turn off that UI module so that like a site administrator doesn't create a view, and then the next time you do a deployment, the view gets deleted because you're reverting all the configuration every time you do a deployment. And you don't want to cause any sort of breakage or confusion or anything like that. So you'll want to remember to do that. And again, it's recommended that to make the general management easier to use some sort of CI tool, Circle CI, Jenkins, to help you push these updates to different environments. All right, now I want to talk briefly about migrating multi-sites. Okay, so migrating a Drupal 7 multi-site is not that much different from migrating, or let me start out. So migrating a multi-site is not that different from migrating a single site. It's just more things can go wrong. And so testing will be absolutely critical. We want to, we'll cover that here in a minute. And I recommend batching migrations. So we've done this a couple different ways. Sometimes we'll go with smallest to largest. That allows you to work out the kinks in the smaller batches and then kind of work your way up to the biggest. That's my preferred method. But sometimes you don't have the luxury of time. And so I've seen it where we just focus on the largest site, get that up and running, put all of your attention on that, and then batch out the rest of the migrations. But doing some sort of batching makes sense. And then talking about just Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 migrations, that's a lot simpler. Again, not that much different from a single site. As you know, updating Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 A lot of the work is in Composer. It's a lot of the work is related to removing deprecated code from your own custom code. And so it's simpler because you don't have to deal with the whole content migration problem that you deal with when it's a Drupal 7 to 8 or 9 migration. Okay, let's talk testing. So this is one of the more critical aspects of managing or migrating multi-site, as we just discussed. There's two tools that I really like, Backstop.js for visual regression testing and Bhat for functional testing. And the idea is that you want to run tests across your whole suite of sites. That's because the more sites you add, the more difficult it is to do a lot of manual testing. You can do some spot testing, but automated test is going to really help you catch all those edge cases. Because again, the more sites you have, the more room for edge cases. And then as we discussed earlier with configuration management, the more variance you allow at the platform level, the increased risk that you have for regressions when you're doing deployments. So you want to have a really solid testing suite. You want to run tests early and often. If you can test them at the branch PR level, that's ideal. If you're not able to do that because it's not practical, then you want to at least do it on those deployments to different environments. So dev, staging, production, you want to run through your full suite of automated tests. And that's going to save you a lot of headaches, whether it's a new multi-site or a migration. Okay, let's talk about new site provisioning. So it's a little bit tedious to do it manually, not that big of a problem. But if you're going to be managing, a lot of sites, then you're going to want some sort of scripted solution. Again, you can do Bash or Jenkins if you're running your own stack. But then if you're using a third-party host, you're going to have a lot of tools at your disposal. Definitely recommend that approach. Third parties just tend to have a lot of tooling and everything. And so let's go ahead and dive right into some of our hosting options here. So Acquia has Acquia Site Factory, which is built specifically for very large multi-sites. So talking about hundreds of sites. So they've got a lot of good tooling and dashboards and things like that. So that should be a consideration. Pantheon's got Upstreams, which works really well. So I addressed that Pantheon doesn't do multi-site the kind of classic way. The way they like to do things is each site has its own resources. This avoids the single point of failure problem with a multi-site. So if everything's sharing the same resources, same code, same everything, and one site breaks, they all break, right? Versus these products like Acquia Site Factory has mitigation around that. Upstream doesn't run into that problem because again, each site has its own dedicated resources, and so I like that product a lot. Acquia, you could also just run a classic multi-site on Acquia Cloud. That might make sense if you're not running a bunch of them. If you're running 10 sites, then just a traditional multi-site on cloud might be totally fine. Platform.sh has can do kind of both approaches. It can do like classic multi-site. It also has fleets, which is sort of like Upstreams. Aegir has been around a long time, and gives you good kind of dashboards for managing sites, and that's something to consider if you're doing like a self-hosted thing. Then of course you could do AWS or whatever. I just would really recommend that you go more the third-party route. So that kind of leads me into my general recommendations. So let's talk about right off the top hosting, right? So you definitely want to get hosting right. Because you want your solution to scale, whatever it is. So I've worked with every situation over a decade, and I've seen a lot more success with managed hosting providers, which I strongly recommend. With a hosting provider, you're going to get SLAs, you're going to get good technical support, you're going to get a lot of tooling, command line stuff at all. So that kind of covers my general thoughts on just, how to handle hosting, right? And so let's cover a couple other things as we just kind of wrap up my general recommendations for multi-sites. So that covers hosting. The next thing is, the last thing on hosting is, so, sometimes because of, legal compliance or whatever, you've got to self-host. I don't like it. I don't like to do self-manage just with the idea of saving money, because in my opinion, you're not going to really save money over the long term. So that's the last thing I'll say on that. And then let's circle back to the original question. Do you need a multi-site? You need to do a lot of thinking on that, right? So could you get away with this? If the idea behind multi-site, if you're mainly using it for microsites, then you really might not need the sort of classic Drupal multi-site. That's where something like using contrib modules to allow some segmentation, so you can do subdomains or you can do campaign pages and things like that. That's where you may want to go down that route instead of messing with a full-blown multi-site. So do some thinking on that. And then the biggest thing is governance. And so the main point I want to point out here with governance and configuration management is that you want to do a lot of planning upfront around that, because as I said, especially if we're talking larger scale implementations, if you don't do it right up front, you're going to have a lot of headaches and it's hard to undo things later on. So do your due diligence there, do a lot of planning around how you want things to be governed. And then last thing is just that testing is paramount. You need a good testing plan from the get-go, and that's going to save you a lot of headaches, not only when you're developing it, but of course when you're maintaining it. So that wraps up that. And so, yeah, that covers, I know I had to kind of cover a lot of material in a short amount of time. I just wanted to make sure we were able to cover everything and get to your questions. So let me see if I can get
Jay,
oh, hey.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm the session monitor. I could read the questions if that would be helpful.
Whichever. I have Shrop also to help. So he can help both ask and answer the question. Shrop has a lot of experience in multi-sites as well.
Okay,
so I'm flexible.
Great. Okay, if you need help, I'll jump back in.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. So we had a few questions here, and thank you, Catherine, for that too. That's awesome. We'll start towards the end here. Someone asked about a link to the slide deck. I would just say quickly that we'll post that through the Drupal Association. They are asking for those slide materials, and so look for that soon on the DrupalCon site. Gianna asked about, I'd love suggestions on resources for D9 or 8 multi-site with Composer.
So you're saying resources via Composer. Well, so it's not going to be that much different if you know Composer. I mean, on it, but I mean, if you know Composer, then I don't see a big difference between single site and multi-site. If you need to learn Composer, then learn Composer. But am I not thinking of something that would be a big difference? Well, that you need to think about?
Yeah, so let us know, Gianna, if there's something we're missing on that. But I agree with Jay. A lot of it has to do with more the configuration of settings PHP and your sites folders than the Composer piece. But certainly multi-site, there is some complexities if you have a lot of different varying sites with different modules running in the same setup. That could impact things. We have a question here, Jay. For the fake multi-site that's using organic group modules in D7, do you recommend group or an organic group module in D9? When this group migrates from D7 to D9? So is there a really? I thought group was the kind of the go-to for D8, but I'm not up to speed on D9 for that.
Right.
One.
So I've used group and organic groups. So those modules help you kind of segment and group, obviously, content and users together. And that can be useful for this sort of thing. that I really want them to like merge together because they both have good features to them. And I've gone back and forth on those modules, like which one to use, where I'm like, okay, I'm definitely using organic groups on this project. And there'll be like one feature that I really need that's in the other module. And then like, so I bounce back and forth. So it depends on your requirements. But if you're just using it for this specific thing, I'd look at domain access, just because domain access was created for this very specific use case, which is multi-site like functionality in a single site instance. I mean, that's what the whole point of the module is, versus like groups and organic groups are kind of more general purpose. They're not all about this specific use case. They're used for different things, right? They're just like ways of grouping content together. But you can use them for like this sort of thing. So you can evaluate all that stuff, but I would look at domain access first.
Great. And Bernardo had a few questions here. We'll start out. How about Nightwatch JS as a testing suite? Thoughts? I'll give a quick weigh in on that one. There are a lot of testing suites, and I think my recommendation is to look at what Drupal supports natively, right? So look at that as a piece to weigh in it. And then if what Drupal core doesn't support in core for testing, then you could make decisions on what's the next best suite. But there's so many out there. And, we even I was talking with somebody in our DevOps team this week about Drupal test traits, as an alternative to Behat. So there's always something out there, right? Something new and different. But I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, Jay.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar. So in the point, obviously, so I mentioned the ones that we use, but the point isn't necessarily like, hey, use this one or that one. It's that you need a really solid testing suite, whatever it is, right? Just because, again, that it's an issue of scale where it's a lot harder to do manual testing. You need to be able to run a lot of automated tests and run them across the whole suite of sites just to keep things more stable and maintainable. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see. We've got our next question here was about using, are we using Workbench module as to simplify end user experience? We have used Workbench. We're using content moderation in core now. I'd say more just because of Drupal 8 and 9. But I don't know if it's so much to simplify the user experience as it is to provide a user experience around just moderating content, in the sense that we have organizations that just don't want every content submitter to be able to publish content. That's usually the core use case that gets us going there.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've used it. I mean, I thought it was helpful. I don't know exactly if would the tie into multi-sites, but yeah.
And there was a question here about, are we transitioning from Pattern Lab into Storybook and other systems? We're still using Pattern Lab, but we've also used Storybook, but that's been more on the React side of the house. Yeah. Chris asked, what's the best way to do multi-site on Pantheon? And there was already some questions and discussion going on in the chat earlier, Jay, where you were talking about Pantheon upstreams. So that may be a precursor.
Right. So, and we didn't have enough time to like dig into a lot of detail around it. So you'll want to review their documentation. But so Pantheon, like when you create a site with Pantheon and you select, Drupal 9 or whatever, that you're going to use like their default upstream. And that's what's actually the code that's used when you're installing your site. But they allow you to create your own upstreams. The only thing that I'm not sure about is if you have to have a certain level account, like if you have to have an agency account or something. I don't think you do. But again, there's a lot of documentation on it, but it's their kind of multi-site solution, and they've written articles on it. It's been around for a long time. It's definitely worth researching. But just like John, I saw mentioned a minute ago, you have the ability to break lots of sites at once. Well, the upstream approach takes away the single point of failure, because all the sites each site has their own dedicated resources, and so you're not going to break them all at once. I guess unless you just deployed everything at once, which I wouldn't recommend. But so they get around the single point of failure problem. So you manage your code base through upstreams, and there's integration with the Terminus tool that they have, which allows you to deploy updates across all your sites running on the same upstream. So there's like a lot of benefits to using their approach. Now, there is like a cost component because you're paying for each individual site, but then it's also flexible because, and again, talk to Pantheon too, because they're going to explain it better than I can. But a lot of organizations have like a couple really big sites that need like enterprise plans or like the higher tier plans. And then they have like a lot of smaller sites that could go with more basic plans. And so Upstreams allows you a lot of flexibility since each site has its own plans and they do bulk discounts and they do all sorts of stuff. But I think it's just like a really solid approach. So it's definitely one that I recommend like investigating and evaluating. Acquia's got good options there as well. So yeah, definitely something worth looking into.
So Mark has asked here, and I'll kind of combine the questions a bit. Do you have experience setting up or experience implementing self-service site deployments in a multi-site? So this would be where somebody that's non-technical goes to like some type of form and fills out a few fields, and then they automatically deploy it. And the follow-up question was any challenges or gotchas with that? Sounds a lot like our multi-site product, Jay.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So we do Acquia Site Factory, gives you a lot of like UI tools. That's their big selling point. And so it makes sense, it's easier to provision new sites and everything like using a dashboard. We've got kind of a newer product we call Multisite Plus that we'll be adding features to this year. And we have a simple workflow that at least makes the provisioning easier. And so we have an integration that all it does is there's a module you turn on and it gives you a form. We set it up for you. It gives you a form and then you submit the form. It kicks off a Jenkins job, and the Jenkins job interacts with Pantheon or Acquia to do the actual setup stuff, but it's sort of behind the scenes. And so like a non-technical person could just submit the form, and that gives them an easy way to spin up a new site without a developer. And so we think that's a pretty good solution for that. It doesn't handle, okay, what about deploying all these updates and everything? You still need like to set up some automation there. And, but it at least helps you solve that kind of common use case we've seen before, which is it's a little bit tedious to set up a new site instance. A lot of times clients are like, I don't know why I need a developer every time I need a new site instance in my multi-site. So again, our little product does kind of glues the thing together a little bit better. But then again, there's alternatives there too, right? So Ager has a lot of tools that give you a dashboard. Acquia has their whole product thing. Pantheon has Upstreams, Platform.sh has their product. So you have like lots of different options.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what's a preferred method for managing multi-sites that require different configurations per site with some similarities? This person has explored explored configuration splits, extensions from base profiles. I think it's a good question. It kind of digs in, Jay, to what you were talking in config split land and some of that.
Yeah. If it's kind of just, if it's less things, then that seems to be kind of the config split direction. That's tends to be where we lean when it's just, we need to carve out a handful of things. So that probably, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say the thing, what's helped me over the years with multi-sites from higher ed on has been don't try to, and I think some chat was maybe happening with this too, but try not to multi-site when you have sites that are very different. So the sites should all be real similar. And Jay, we've talked about this a ton too internally at Media Current, but when you have a group of sites and they're all going to have very similar themes, similar module uses, similar features built on top, that's where multi-sites of some sort, and where I'm saying multi-site lowercase, all these different ways to do it. That seems to help quite a bit.
Yeah, I would just say that we've been able to handle variants. I like the install profile route where you just have different install profiles. That gives you some ways to organize things in a certain way. So you have certain custom modules within each profile and different configurations. So you can have a pretty fair amount of dependent variants while taking advantage of a shared composer. And so, I like to try to steer in that direction if at all possible. Obviously, sometimes it's like, square peg, round hole. If it just doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. But, from my standpoint, I like it when an organization is able to have a more unified platform. If they're standardizing on Drupal, I like them to be able to have that shared platform, even if there is a good amount of variance between, like, maybe they have a bunch of different brands or whatever, that does have a lot of variance. And so again, it's gonna vary, but I like to start with, hey, let's try to do a unified platform approach and then go from there,
And that plays in direct. I think the unified approach plays in directly in your previous talk about governance. Into the next question, this attendee said they recently joined a project where they're using multi-sites with separate config for each site. Right now, we're copy and pasting in config changes between each multi-site. Is there a better way? And we feel your pain. That sounds challenging for sure.
And this is a good item if we want to do extended discussion over it, because we'll after we get to the initial batch of questions, we can jump over to the media current booth, and that's where we could do some solutioning, but you'll want to figure that out, because obviously you want to get away from the copy and paste kind of thing. So you're running into that scale problem, which is it's not practical to do all this copy and paste stuff. And so maybe some refactoring. There's so many ways you could tackle that I'd rather go dig into that a little bit more. So that might be a good thing to jump over to the booth for after we wrap up here. So these kind of long form questions where I need more information.
Yeah, I think that makes sense for sure. And so let's hit maybe a few of the what might be simpler ones, and we'll jump to the booth. I have collected the questions the best I can, and I'll have those over there. So how about this one? Can you expand on the pros and cons of config actions versus config split and features?
I can a little bit. So I'm got more experience with features in config split. So config actions, one of the cons is that you're doing YAML stuff. It's not point and click like with features. And features has been around a long time, but templates are what's config actions. Yeah. So they set up templates. It allows you to override them. They let you do some really flexible stuff. And we use it on some of our Site factory implementations. It seems like a good fit there for those type of implementations. But it's super flexible. It's going to require you to do YAML stuff like that. If you don't feel super comfortable with that, features is nice because you've got a nice UI where you just point and click the different configurations, and then you click a button to download it somewhere, and it's all site builder kind of skills. And so, I like its pretty simple approach. But the config actions is going to be more flexible. So there you go.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So here's one I think I can pick up here a bit, at least on some options. Any recommendation regarding how to control a Drupal profile in a multi-site installation, to have it versioned in a separate repo and managed with Composer, or versioned within your Drupal? And I've worked on a site factory multi-site, which is it's an Acquia site factory. It's a different, it's a product built on multi-site and lots of other things there. But we started out with a profile, and then the client wanted to have additional profiles, and then we wound up going back to fewer profiles. But all of the profiles lived in the same code base in this particular project. I will just say there have been times in my career where I've decided to split off and have different repos for like different sets of modules or shared modules and things like that. And Jay, you remember some of these examples we've talked about. Like there's times when it makes sense, but it comes with every time you split off repos and you're pulling everything in, it comes with a huge maintenance cost.
Yeah, cost. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you want to do smart. I've seen it go to the insane level of splitting off like every module or whatever, which is kind of crazy. I do want to tackle this features thing is
in the chat.
So we don't use features very much.
Yeah.
So I want to put that out there. But the use case I like is when you want, let's say you want to create like a library of like paragraphs or blocks and share those across the multi-site, but then allow some variants. Then you can have the features that makes them available, and they can turn them on to turn on the paragraph type or whatever, and then get customized. And so again, you're controlling those specific things at a platform level. Maybe the sites still kind of own their own configuration, but they have access to this library of configuration that they can use. And so that's kind of what features was intended to be used for. In Drupal 7, we ended up using it as like a poor man's configuration management. And then that went away in favor of Drupal configuration management, which is great. But like there are use cases for features. And to me, this is what it was for, intended for, is this sort of thing, is like just packaging together some piece of functionality and allowing sites to enable that, allowing them to override it. But again, having some, platform control over that specific thing. So there you go. There's my pitch for features. But again, we don't use it very often.
Yeah, features original purpose, even back in the previous to D8 days, the intention was to package features. That's what I would say. Whether you want to use it or not, or it makes sense or not, that was the intent. And we in D7 we wound up using it for managing things before we had Drupal config. So last couple of questions I think here in the Q&A, and we could jump maybe to the booth. Media Current booth next, but how can you manage configurations for different sites in a multi-site setup? I think we've talked around a lot of this already, but it depends on your setup. But if you're talking Drupal config and things like that, it's there's a number of different approaches. This would be a good one, I think, for the booth.
If they have more information, then then we could dig into that in the bonus Q&As, I call it.
Yep, totally. And then any cool tips on managing module usage across multi-sites, or just continue to create spreadsheets from hell out of Drush. And that sounds like that there's definitely some pains there.
Yeah. So we want to use Composer for one. For custom modules, I like the ability to do some organization in custom install profiles. That doesn't really help you with like contrib. If you have so much variance even at like the contrib level, but then maybe it doesn't make sense to have a multi-site at all, because at that point you're like, well, these sites are too dissimilar. But so hopefully you're finding that you're able to take advantage of a lot of sharing with that. And then I like the ability to organize custom logic within install profiles. To keep things kind of clean and organized, even when you have like a lot of, I'm saying variance a lot, but a lot of variance between the different types of sites. You have different flavors of those sites.
Well, great. Well, I appreciate everybody for joining today. And Jay, thanks for this awesome talk. Seems like it resonates. It's a very complex topic. But we will jump over here. I think it's
fun. I like multi-sites. They're fun. So enjoyed talking with you all today. Thank you very much for attending. And I will see some of you hopefully at a physical DrupalCon at some point in the future. And then let's keep talking about multi-site questions over at the booth.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.